Good evening, everyone. My name is David Chard. I'm the Dean of BU's Wheelock College of Education and Human Development. And I thank you. It's my honor to welcome you to our fifth forum, BU Forum. This event started when we merged historic Wheelock College with Boston University and was really meant to bring together the communities of students, faculty, partners, alumni, around common topics of interest that we felt could help us get to know each other's work, but also understand the work that we have to do ahead of us. And by far, this has been our most popular forum to date. So we want to contribute to a broad dialogue on any given topic. And the way we structure our forum is to partner with a research center or institute within our college to identify topics that are timely and important to our field. This year, we are lucky to partner with the National Center to Improve Literacy, one of the centers, federally funded centers at BU Wheelock. And the focus, primary focus of our work tonight and tomorrow is to focus on supporting students with reading-related disabilities. We want to examine current trends in reading achievement for children with reading disabilities, including dyslexia, and explore why national reading assessment performance dipped significantly during COVID-19, even here in Massachusetts. It is my distinct honor to introduce our keynote speaker for this evening. Oh, and by the way, I have to apologize. The Red Sox organized opening day for the first night of our forum, which is in part why people have been slow to gather. So we will adjust that in our I don't even know who won, actually. Do we? We lost. This is what happens when you organize it on the same day as the forum. But it is my distinct honor to introduce tonight's keynote speaker, Emily Hanford. Emily has been working in public media for more than 2 decades as a reporter, producer, editor, news director, and program host. Her work has won numerous honors, including a DuPont Columbia University Award and a Casey Medal. In 2017, she won the Excellence in Media Reporting on Education Research, an Education Research Award from the American Education Research Association, of which many of us are members. Her groundbreaking podcast episode, Hard Works, on why children aren't being taught to read, Hard Words, excuse me, on why children aren't being taught to read, was a winner of the inaugural Public Service Award from the Education Writers Association, EWA, in 2019. Emily is a member of the EWA Journalist Advisory Board and a longtime mentor for EWA's New to the Beat program. She is a frequent speaker and moderator. Emily is based in the Washington, D.C. area, and she is a graduate of Amherst College. Her title of tonight's keynote is How Teaching Kids to Read Went Wrong. Emily?
Thank you so much for that nice introduction, and thank you for having me. I'm really glad to be here. Welcome. So I am here tonight to tell you some of what I have learned over the past 6 years about how kids learn to read and how many of them are being taught in school. And here's the bottom line. In many schools all over the country, kids are not being taught how to read. Schools think they're teaching kids to read. Of course they do. But there's this big body of scientific research about reading and how it works and how people learn to do it. And this research shows very clearly that there are critical skills that all of us need to learn to become good readers. And in lots of schools, kids aren't being taught these skills. And it's not just that. It's that many kids are being taught strategies for how to read that are making it harder for some of them to learn. They are being taught the strategies that struggling readers use to get by. They are actually being taught to read the way that poor readers read. And their teachers have no idea, or they had no idea until recently, many of them, because many teachers didn't know about all of this scientific research on reading. They didn't know what this research says about how skilled reading works and what kids need to learn. Teachers are typically shocked when they learn about this research because this research isn't new. It's been around for a long time, for decades. There have been big government reports about it, thousands of studies, articles, books, but many teachers didn't know. Some of you maybe didn't know. I didn't know, and I'm an education reporter. I've been an education reporter for nearly a decade, and I was before I learned really about any of this. And so what I've been trying to figure out is why. Why didn't we know? So that's why I made the podcast Sold a Story. I'm going to tell you the story of how this podcast came to be and what I've learned about the so-called science of reading over the past 5 years. So first, I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself. I grew up just a few miles from here in Brookline, in a neighborhood that we called Whiskey Point. I went to Lincoln School. I graduated from Brookline High School. Here is my first grade school picture. Yes, it's especially dorky, and my mother clearly had nothing to say about what I wore to school, even on picture day. So I'll let you guess what year it is, and you can keep that to yourselves. I'll tell you at the end. I'll give you a few hints. So I am someone who loved school, like loved it so much that when I was a senior in college at Amherst College, I decided to leave school before graduation. I didn't want to graduate. One semester left, and I told my parents, I'm out of here. I want to take a leave. I had always been a student. I'd always been a very good student and a very happy student. And I was frankly terrified about what I was going to do when I wasn't a student anymore. So I did eventually return to college, and I got my degree in English. So I became a journalist, good use of an English degree, and a really good degree. I'm very happy I got it. And I loved going back to school, and I'm glad I got the degree. Anyway, I was a journalist for a long time, and eventually I became a mother. So I have 2 boys. You can see here that they are New England sports fans. So they grew up, they were born in North Carolina. They grew up in Maryland. But as you can see, my husband grew up just like less than a mile from here. So New England sports are in their blood. This photo was taken on their first day of school when the little one was starting kindergarten and the big one was starting 3rd grade. And it was actually a pretty long time ago. So they are now 22 and 19. Actually, that little guy is turning 20 in just a few weeks. The little one actually spent last summer, after his first year in college, working down the street at Fenway Park. He worked for the Red Sox last summer. He had a free apartment in the South End. I mean, come on, when you're 19. But when my boys went off to school, I didn't think about how they were going to be taught to read. I certainly didn't think about whether they were going to be taught to read. I assumed that they would. I think most parents assume it. And they did learn to read pretty easily. So this is the little guy. This is just a few months into kindergarten, and he's reading a chapter book, and I have no idea how he learned to do that. I have no idea how he learned to read. The older one learned pretty easily too, not quite as easily. I think I learned to read pretty easily. I don't really remember very much about it. And I think sometimes when you don't remember very much about it, it was probably pretty easy for you, because people for whom it was hard have some very bad memories of learning how to read. So it just kind of happened for me and my kids. It kind of felt like magic. And it just kind of happens is what I think I actually sort of believed or thought about how kids learn to read. Like I said, I just didn't have any reason to think about it much. Until 2017, when I started to realize how wrong I was. When I started to realize that my kids and I were actually just really lucky. We were lucky because reading came easily to us, and lots of people are not lucky when it comes to learning how to read. It's not easy for them. It's really, really hard. In fact, learning to read is really hard for quite a few people, a lot more people than I realized. And it doesn't have to do with intelligence, right? A lot of really smart people have a hard time learning how to read. So this is me as a reporter. In 2017, I had already been a full-time education reporter for almost 10 years. In fact, the dean said that I've been doing this for 20 years. In fact, that's an old bio. It's almost 30 years now. So there's a hint about how old I am. I've been a reporter for about 30 years, but I've been reporting on education since 2008. So by 2017, I had already been a full-time education reporter for about a decade. As an education reporter, I was really interested in a couple of key things, key questions. So how family income generally and how poverty in particular affect educational opportunities and outcomes, and also how people learn, like the findings from cognitive science and how those play out or not in classrooms. Almost all the reporting that I did was focused on secondary and post-secondary education. So this photo of me in the classroom with the little kids was the very first reporting project that I did for American Public Media. It was about preschool. And then I really didn't do very much at all on earlier elementary education until I got interested in reading back in 2017. And that is when I realized that early reading instruction is really where it's at if you are interested in educational equity, opportunity, and how people learn. So this is the first reporting project that I did about reading. It's called Hard to Read. It's a podcast episode and an article, and it's about why students with dyslexia have such a hard time getting the help they need in school. Now, I knew virtually nothing about dyslexia. I didn't even think I knew anyone with dyslexia. Of course I do. Now I realize that I know a lot of people with dyslexia. But here's what happened. I was hearing the same story, like the exact same story, from parents all over the country. And the story goes like this. Our child started school and we knew something wasn't right. We went to the teacher and the teacher said, don't worry, make sure you read lots of books to her. Everything's going to be fine. And it went on and on like this, sometimes for years. The parents saying, something's wrong here. The school saying, don't worry, it'll all come together in time. We've just got to find her the right book. And here's what eventually happens if the family has time and money, especially money. They pay for private testing to try to figure out what's going on. This private testing typically costs thousands of dollars. They might pay for private tutoring, which is very quickly thousands of dollars too. They might hire an educational consultant or an attorney or both to help them fight for what their child needs. And all of this is not just expensive, it's exhausting, it's frustrating, and it's really, really, really hard. And the parents begin to realize that their child may never get what she needs in school. Or she's not going to get it fast enough because now she's 8 or 9 or 10 years old, and you know what? She really doesn't like school. And she's falling behind in other subjects because she can't read very well. Maybe she's beginning to act out in school, or maybe it's manifesting as anxiety and withdrawal and depression. And maybe their child has actually said, I want to kill myself. A whole bunch of parents have said this to me. Really shocking, an alarming number. Little kids who say that they want to die because they can't read. And this is when, if they have the resources, the family pulls their child out of public school. So maybe they homeschool her, or maybe the family figures out a way to come up with the tens of thousands of dollars that it can cost to send the child to a specialized private school, if there's a good private school nearby that they can get into. And that is a huge if in a lot of parts of this country. So here's the situation that I think that we're in, or at least that we were. If you can come up with the money to pay for it, you can probably find a way for your struggling reader to be taught how to read. But if you don't have the money and your child is not learning to read in school, what do? The equity implications of this are really stunning. If you're from a low or even a moderate middle income family, there's really no safety net, there's no backup if you're not being taught how to read in school. One mom in Maryland put it to me this way. She said, getting help for a struggling reader is a rich man's game. So we're talking about reading, which is really the most basic fundamental skill and the foundation upon which all academic learning gets built. So that is a rich man's game. So how did that happen? How is it allowed to continue? So I surprised myself by thinking, well, there's more reporting to be done on this topic. So this led me to the next reporting project, which was mentioned in the introduction, Hard Words. So Hard Words is about core reading instruction, classroom instruction. So not what needs to be done for struggling readers in particular, but rather what do all children need to learn to become good readers? Because the bottom line from decades of scientific research on reading is that what kids with dyslexia need to learn to become good readers is not substantially different from what all kids need to learn to become good readers. Kids with dyslexia will need a more intensive dose of a certain kind of instruction, but all kids can benefit from the kind of instruction that kids with dyslexia desperately need. So this brings me to the term, the science of reading. It's a term that a lot of people are using these days. So what is it? What is the science of reading? I hear it being used in inaccurate ways a lot. So here's how Mark Seidenberg defines it. So he's a cognitive scientist. He's been studying reading since the 1970s. And here's his definition of the science of reading. So the science of reading, he says, is a body of basic research in developmental psychology, educational psychology, cognitive science, and cognitive neuroscience on reading, one of the most complex human behaviors, and its biological bases. This research has been conducted for decades in the United States and around the world. The research has important implications for helping children to succeed, but it has not been incorporated in how teachers are trained for the job or how children are taught. So I'm going to give you a very brief and very high-level summary of what scientists have figured out about how children learn to read. And I think many of you in this room know this. So then I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I've learned about how reading is being taught in many schools and how this instruction conflicts in some ways with what scientists have actually learned. So to understand how children learn to read, a really good place to begin is something called the simple view of reading. And I'm sure some of you know this. So the simple view of reading, really important here, does not say that reading is simple. To the contrary, reading is really complex. The simple view of reading is a simple model to understand a complex process. So the simple view of reading was first proposed in 1986 by two researchers, Philip Goff and William Tunmer. So I was a student at Brookline High School at the time in 1986. And they proposed this model because they were trying to clarify the role of decoding in reading comprehension, because everyone agrees that the goal of reading and the goal of teaching kids to read is so that they can comprehend text. Everyone agrees on that. Comprehension is the goal. The question is, how does a little kid get there? So the simple view says that reading comprehension is the product, not the sum, the product of two things. So one is your ability to decode words or recognize printed words. So you see the letter string R-E-A-D-I-N-G, and you know that that string of letters represents the word reading. The other part of the equation is your language comprehension, right? So that's your ability to understand spoken language. So we're not talking about your ability to read text. Language comprehension is your ability to understand meaning when someone is talking or when someone is reading out loud to you. So for example, when someone says to you, she is reading the book, you know what the verb means, you know what she's doing. The simple view says that if you have really good language comprehension skills, but zero decoding skills, your reading comprehension will be zero, because 0 times anything is 0. Simple view also says that if you have really good decoding skills, but very poor language comprehension skills, you just don't know the meaning of that many words in spoken language, well, your reading comprehension will not be very good either. So let's look at how this applies to learning how to read, right? So most kids entering school have very little when it comes to the decoding part of the equation, right? They have 0 or close to 0 when it comes to the D in the simple view of reading equation. But they do have something when it comes to the language comprehension part of the equation. In other words, when children enter school, they know the meaning of lots of words, but they don't know how to decode those words yet. They can't read them. This is why people familiar with the science of reading call for an emphasis on phonics instruction in the early grades. Because if the goal is to get to reading comprehension, and you have a bunch of 5- and 6-year-olds who have language comprehension skills, but virtually no decoding skills, what do you need to do to help those children get to reading comprehension? You need to help those children develop decoding skills. What you want to focus on with little kids is getting their decoding skills up to their level of language comprehension. Now, the simple view clearly shows that focusing only on decoding would be a very, very, very big mistake, because it's only part of the equation. And as everyone knows, as I'm sure you all know, as lots of research has shown us, kids come into school with very different language comprehension skills, right? Some kids know the meaning of lots and lots and lots of words. There are very, very precocious 5-year-olds out there, and some kids don't. Some kids have far smaller vocabularies, far less language comprehension ability. So reading instruction that aligns with this simple view has to focus on the language comprehension part of the equation too. So that means lesson, activities, teaching that expand children's oral vocabulary, their language comprehension. So I was in a first grade classroom a few years ago where reading instruction was deliberately aligned with the simple view of reading. The teacher had learned about it recently and was really trying to make this happen in her classroom. So what I saw was explicit decoding instruction in one part of the reading instruction, right? And the kids were broken into small groups depending on the level of their decoding skills, because kids can be at very different places. And another part of the reading instruction was explicit vocabulary lessons and lots of reading out loud by the teacher. And the words that the kids had learned were posted on cards all over the classroom. And this was the springtime, and these cards were everywhere. They were starting to cover the windows. And they were words like extraordinary, gigantic, neighborly, and ridiculous. So those are not words that the vast majority of first graders are going to be able to decode, and they shouldn't be expected to. But the first graders who were in this class were learning the pronunciation and meaning of these words so that when they're able to decode them, they'll know what the words mean. And by the way, every single child in this class, according to the teacher, spoke English as a second language, and some of the kids in the class spoke English as a third language. So as I said, the simple view was proposed as a theoretical model back in 1986, and the basics of this model have been confirmed over and over again since. The simple view is helpful. It's really helpful. It seems to really help a lot of teachers get this, and it disentangles some of the stuff that is most contentious in the debates about reading, right? So in what's known as the whole language view, and in the balanced literacy view more recently, the focus right from the start of reading instruction should be on getting kids to focus on the meaning of what they're reading, right? Whole language and balanced literacy are meaning emphasis approaches to reading instruction, as opposed to what's known as a code emphasis approach, which emphasizes decoding skills at the beginning of reading instruction. So early reading instruction that aligns with the scientific research is a code emphasis approach so that kids can get to meaning. Everyone agrees that meaning is the goal. The question is, how does a little kid get there? So let me turn now to how children are being taught to read in many American schools. Beginning readers in many American schools are being taught a variety of strategies for figuring out written words. Strategies like these. So this was sent home by, this was sent to me by a parent in the Boston area. I won't say what school system. Her kid brought this home in his backpack. These are all strategies for kids to use when they're reading and they come to a word they don't know. And these strategies seem really sensible. They make a lot of sense. You get to a word you don't know, what can you do? So you can look at the picture to try to figure out what the word might be. You don't want to completely guess, so you can look at the first letter. You can look at how the word begins. That's going to narrow your choices. You can then check to see if you were right. You can reread the sentence using the word, see if the sentence makes sense. And if you're stuck, you can just skip the word and move on. Hopefully you can get the gist of the sentence anyway. So what's up with this? Like, what is the idea about how reading works that these strategies are based on? That's what I started to think about. What is this? What's the idea about how kids learn to read? And when I realized that there is an idea, there's a theory behind this approach, behind these strategies. So they're rooted in a theory about reading that came to be known as cueing or 3-cueing, and not everyone calls it that, okay? But basically the idea is that readers use different kinds of information or clues or cues to identify the words as they're reading. The theory was proposed back in the 1960s, and the basic idea behind the cueing theory is that readers don't have to sound out written words to know what they are. They can sound out the words, but they don't have to because they have other strategies they can use to figure out what the words say. They can do things like look at the first letter of a word, use the context, think of a word that makes sense, use the pictures, essentially predict what the words will be. So At a Loss for Words is the next reporting project. I couldn't get away from this topic. So now it's 2019, And this is a podcast episode and an article, and it's about this queuing theory. And in particular, it's about how the queuing theory and the word reading strategies became foundational in reading curriculum, assessments, and intervention programs that are very popular in American schools that say they use a balanced literacy approach to teaching reading, right? The problem here is the queuing theory isn't right. It's not how skilled reading works. And cognitive scientists showed this back in the 1970s and 80s, and the research was really clear by the 1990s. Skilled readers do not use cues and context to identify words as they're reading. In fact, what scientists figured out is that this is how poor readers read. Poor readers often have a hard time with word identification. Too many of the words that they come across are little mysteries, series of letters they don't know and can't quite figure out. They don't know what to do with them. So they use a bunch of other strategies to try to figure out what the words say. When they come across a word they don't know, they look at the first few letters, they try to think of a word that makes sense. In other words, they use context to try to come up with a word that fits. And when they can't figure out what a word is using context clues, they skip the word. And again, often they can get the gist of what they're reading this way. But using context, guessing, and skipping words, this is not what reading is like when you are a skilled reader. What cognitive scientists have figured out is that this is a key difference between skilled readers and unskilled readers. Skilled readers can immediately and accurately recognize words. They don't need to guess or predict or use the context. Skilled readers know tens of thousands of words instantly on sight. In fact, if you're a skilled reader, your brain has gotten so good at reading words, which is kind of amazing because we're not born with brains that are wired to read. We're not really supposed to be able to do this. But you can get so good at it that you process the word book faster than you process a picture of a book, right? So how did your brain get so good at that, right? We don't have brains that are wired to read because written language is new. We've been talking to each other for hundreds of thousands of years, but we just came up with written language like a few thousand years ago. And it was really only relatively recently that most people needed to be able to read and write to thrive in the economy, in the world. So how did your brain get so good at reading the words when you're a skilled reader? So it happens through this process that some people call orthographic mapping. And I think understanding some of the basics of orthographic mapping is really helpful in understanding why teaching kids how to decode words is so important. The why here really matters. And also why teaching the strategies, those cueing strategies, is not a good idea. So here's a really quick and very simplified explanation of orthographic mapping. So it's the process that we use to store printed words in our long-term memory. So the way you do that is by attending closely to how a written word is spelled and then linking that sequence of letters to the word's pronunciation and its meaning. So for a really basic example, a child coming into school, an English learner mostly knows the meaning, an English speaker mostly knows the meaning and pronunciation of the word cat, right? So the word cat gets orthographically mapped to her memory when she links the sounds cat to the written word cat. So that requires an awareness of the speech sounds and words. That's phonemic awareness. It also requires an understanding of how those sounds are represented by letters. So that's phonics. So you need phonemic awareness and phonics to orthographically map words into your long-term memory. And once a word has been mapped to your memory, you know it instantly on sight. In fact, you cannot suppress your ability to read the word. You don't have to consciously sound it out when you see it, but you know it instantly because at some point, maybe long ago, when you were 7 or 8 years old, you successfully sounded it out and you linked the spelling of the word in your mind with the meaning and the pronunciation of that word. And by about 2nd grade, a typically developing reader who has good phonics skills needs just a few exposures to a word in English through its pronunciation, its spelling, and its meaning, and bam, the word is mapped to her memory. And the more words a reader maps to her memory this way, the more she can focus on the meaning of what she's reading. She's not using her brain power to identify the word, she's using her brain power to understand what she's reading, and that's the goal, for readers to comprehend what they're reading. But when teachers use the cueing system, when they teach all those different word reading strategies, they're actually impeding this orthographic mapping process. And I'm going to explain that with a story. So these are first graders. They were anyway. They're in middle school now, but they were first graders when this photograph was taken in Oakland, California. And a literacy coach who worked with these girls came to see that teaching the cueing system was actually making it harder for many of her students to learn how to read. The coach's name is Margaret Goldberg. She was hired by the Oakland Unified School District in 2015 to teach something called leveled literacy intervention. So LLI is a reading intervention program that does include some phonics instruction, because remember, one of the cues for figuring out a word is to use the letters, so some phonics. But LLI is rooted in the idea, right? In the idea that one way to figure out a word is to sound it out, but that there are all these other ways. So kids are also taught that when they come to a word they don't know, they can use pictures and context to try to come up with the word, to try to come up with a good guess. Margaret Goldberg started using the LLI program. She started teaching it. That's what she was hired to do. Around the same time, she found a bunch of unopened materials sitting on a shelf in her school, collecting dust, a familiar thing in schools. Schools buy a lot of things. And it was a systematic phonics and phonemic awareness program that teaches kids when they come to a word they don't know, they sound it out. And it doesn't teach kids these cueing strategies. And in this phonics and phonemic awareness program, beginning readers at the very early stages of learning how to read practice reading in decodable books that contain words with spelling patterns they've been taught, so they don't have to guess at the words. They don't have to use those other strategies. Margaret started teaching some of her groups of students LLI with the cueing strategies, and some of her groups she taught systematic phonics and phonemic awareness without the cueing. And she started to notice differences between the two groups of kids, not just in how well they were reading, but in the way they approached their reading. So she and a colleague recorded first graders talking about what makes them good readers. So this is a video that I'm going to play for you. Mia is the one in the white shirt. So she was learning the phonics and no cueing. And Jabria in the pink jacket was taught the cueing system.
Guess what makes you good readers?
I learn a lot because I look at the pictures and I read it.
Do you remember when you were little and you didn't?
Uh-oh. Uh-oh. Did I do something bad? Geez, I don't think I did. Can someone help me? It's all good. I just put my water down, but I don't think it was. No, it wasn't. It wasn't my fault. Look at the computer. Is that all good? Should I just go do that? All right. Talk amongst yourselves. What are you thinking? Sorry. All right, it's all good. Seriously, let me see. What would be a good question? I guess discuss like this, you know, I go to a lot of conferences and other people are so good at doing it and giving you all opportunities to talk to each other, turn and talk. And I'm like, I should integrate some of that stuff in. Here, take that out of the way.
Something down here.
I can also continue without it. It's probably okay, but let's give it 2 more minutes. That's good. I'm going to get my phone and my flashlight. Oh, no, it's downstairs. It's downstairs. Sorry. Anyone have a phone with a flashlight? Phone with a flashlight? Phone with a flashlight? Helpful? I think the cable might be. Oh, okay. All right, I'll just do it without it. It's fine. We'll just continue on. Here you go. Sorry. All right, we are going to punt and do the rest without slides. Here we go. So anyway, you guys missed the great moment with me and I can't believe that was a good moment though. Okay, so basically what happens in the video. Oh, did it just come back? Never mind. Whoa. All right, never mind. So basically you started to get the gist of it right there. So little Mia, keep it open. Thank you. Okay, keep it open. Otherwise we're going to see what's on someone's laptop here. Okay. So essentially what happens is Mia in the little white shirt says at the end of the video when they're asked, how do you learn how to read? Little Jabria in the pink jacket says, I look at the pictures and I read it. And little Mia says, I look at the words and I sound them out. It's very, very from the mouth of babes. They've taken away a very different idea just about reading and what it is. What is it? Is it really reading the words or is it looking at the pictures? So what happened is that Margaret was seeing this over and over again in her two groups of students, right? So one group was taking away from their reading instruction that reading is about looking carefully at words and sounding them out. And the other group of children was learning that when you come to a word you don't know, you don't have to look carefully at the word and try to connect the spelling with the pronunciation and the meaning. Instead, you can look away from the word. You can look at the picture, you can look at the other words in the sentence. Basically, you search around for clues to help you identify the word. But remember, orthographic mapping requires you to look carefully at words so your brain links the spelling with the sounds and the meaning, right? And cueing teaches kids to look away from the words. So here's what Margaret Goldberg said to me about the kids in her LLI groups. She said this, I did lasting damage to these kids. It was so hard to ever get them to stop looking at a picture to guess what a word would be. It was so hard to ever get them to slow down and sound a word out because they had had this experience of knowing that you predict what you read before you read it. So as Margaret was noticing the differences between her two groups of students, she was discovering all of the scientific research
Yes,
on
what
reading.
makes you
There
good
we go.
readers?
I learn a lot. Because I look at the pictures and
It's not the cord, maybe it's that's the same, okay. The computer doesn't like my PowerPoint. Here we go. It's fine. It's on YouTube and somehow we'll send you the link. It's really cute. Go to YouTube, it's words or pictures. Are we trying one more time? No, we're not. Okay, here we go. Okay. All right. So Margaret started learning about all scientific research on reading. And she was really surprised because she didn't know anything about it. And she was shocked by what she was learning and how different it was from what the curriculum materials were telling her about how reading works, right? But what Margaret was learning from the curriculum materials about how reading works is what a lot of teachers are learning about how reading works, because instructional approaches that include these cueing strategies are all over American classrooms. And not teaching kids how to read the words, telling them there are lots of ways to figure out what the words say has consequences. So this is a documentary when I was still on this topic in 2020. It's an article and podcast episode, and it starts with a visit to a juvenile detention center, where if you want to find struggling readers, that's where you should go. You're going to find an awful lot of them in prison and in juvenile detention centers. And I went to this juvenile detention center in Texas to meet kids who were being taught how to read while they were locked up. It was part of a study. I met a 17-year-old named Deshaun, and I asked him what he remembered about being taught to read in school. And he didn't remember a whole lot, but he said to me it was hard. I didn't understand the words. And I asked what he was learning in his reading lessons while he was in juvenile detention. And he said one of the things he learned is that PH makes the f sound. Like physics, he said, really pretty delighted. I never knew that. So I don't know how Deshaun was taught to read. I don't know if he was taught the cueing strategies, but he didn't learn what he needed to know about how written English works. until he was 17 when he was locked up in a juvenile detention facility. So this brings me back to my own kid. There he is. Oliver is his name. I told you that I don't know how he learned to read. It just sort of seemed to happen. And it does turn out that reading comes pretty easily to some of us. We don't need much instruction. So, right, a lot of exposure to a book, sitting on a parent's lap, caregiver's lap, while they point to words and sound them out, and you get a little bit of instruction in school, and you start to put it all together, and you crack the code and you figure it out. But it isn't true for a lot of us. So this is a slide that I'm sure some of you have seen, and it compiles estimates from a number of studies, and you can go on to the website and you can see the studies that are behind this. It's made by a woman named Nancy Young in Canada. And this slide shows that about, no one knows for sure, but roughly 40% of kids or so are going to learn to read no matter how you teach them, right? A little bit of instruction and immersion in a literate environment, immersion in a literate environment, it's important. It's probably going to do the job. But more than half of all kids, maybe 60% or so, are not going to learn to read well unless they're explicitly taught how to do it. And some kids are going to need a whole lot of explicit instruction. And a key thing for everyone to understand is that all kids can benefit from explicit instruction. Even those kids who may not need it can become better readers, and especially they can become better spellers if they are taught how to read and spell. And the research shows that nearly everyone can learn to read if they're taught. So how are we doing? I'm sure you've seen these. These are NAEP scores before COVID, okay? So before COVID, I put it up here on purpose. We all know that things are worse now, but this is not a new problem. NAEP is the National Assessment of Educational Progress. It's a test given every 2 years to a sample of kids across the country. So the 2019 scores showed us that more than a third of fourth graders could not read at a basic level. So we're not talking about proficiency here. We're talking about basic. More than a third of all fourth graders could not read on even a basic level, and it's worse now. And this slide shows the differences among racial and ethnic groups. So I want you to notice that more than half of all kids are at basic or below in every single subgroup, except Asian Pacific Islander, which is close to half at basic or below, okay? And now look at the gaps. So 82% of Black fourth graders at basic or below. So more than 8 in 10. Think about that. A class of 20 Black kids and only 4 of them are proficient readers. So scores on this test have changed not a whole lot since the early 1990s when this version of the test started being given. When I hear people try to explain these scores, sometimes something that I almost always hear is poverty, right? And I am not saying that poverty has nothing to do with it. Poverty absolutely plays a role, especially on the language comprehension side of things, right? Think of that simple view of reading. But this is much bigger than poverty. We have far more kids who are struggling with reading than are struggling with poverty. And I think we've been blaming poverty when part of what's going on here has to do with wealth. So some kids are lucky enough to be born into families that can take care of the problem if they are not taught how to read in school. They have a safety net. That safety net is their parents and their parents' checkbooks. So some kids are getting the instruction they need, but lots of kids aren't. And so this is really, at the end of the day, an equity issue. It is a civil rights issue. So this is Sold a Story, which is the podcast that I did that came out in the fall. And it's 6 episodes and it's 4.5 hours of listening. And it's really about one idea, the whole thing. It's about one idea. And I remember saying to my editor, can we do a whole podcast about one idea? And she's like, I don't know, maybe. And the idea is this: beginning readers don't have to sound out words. They can, but they don't have to, because there are other ways to figure out what the words say. That's it. That's the idea. But that is a foundational idea in the balanced literacy approach to teaching reading, right? And there was a 2020 survey by Education Week, and 72% of K through 2 and special ed teachers said that their schools use balanced literacy, right? And people have lots of different definitions of that, and it sounds really good because balance is what we're going for in early reading instruction. We definitely want balance. A balance between those 2 parts of the simple view of reading, the word reading part and the language comprehension part. The problem, though, with balanced literacy is that there's a theory at the base of it about how kids learn to read, how they learn to read the words in particular, and it's not right. And by telling kids that they can sound out the words, but they don't have to, we don't have to teach you explicitly how to do that. Balanced literacy ends up teaching kids the strategies of struggling readers. And many struggling readers use these strategies even if they're not taught them. These are the strategies they come up with on their own when they don't know how to read the words. But it's even worse that we're actually teaching kids to do it. We're teaching kids the habits of struggling readers. So I get notes and emails from teachers almost every day who tell me they didn't know this. They didn't know there was anything wrong with those strategies. They seem to make sense. And they're learning now. And many of these teachers are really trying to change the way they teach. So here's one of the emails that I just got just like 2 weeks ago. It's from a woman who's in her 24th year of teaching elementary school. And she wrote, "I never knew about the science of reading, and it blows my mind. I have been a reading specialist," and she put it in quotes, "and trained by using LLI. She said, Sold a Story changed my perspective and impacted me more than anything I've ever read, listened, or learned. I've encouraged my principal, colleagues, and even family members and friends to listen. I'm nearing the end of my teaching career, but have a new passion for helping anyone, young or old, who is struggling with reading." So I'm really hopeful because of teachers like this. I'm really optimistic that knowing better will mean doing better, but not necessarily, right? I'm concerned too. There are a lot of laws being passed right now. Policymakers in at least 7 states are seeking bans on curriculum that is rooted in this queuing theory. And as policymakers take things away, it will increase the pressure on schools to buy new things. And there's no perfect curriculum out there. I don't think there ever will be. And even if there was a perfect curriculum, it wouldn't be enough because curriculums don't teach kids, teachers do, right? Teachers need good materials, they really do. They need good assessments, they need good intervention programs, but they really need the knowledge most. And with knowledge, they're better able to see for themselves the flaws in the materials, right? It's hard. Many teachers just didn't know how kids learn to read. They didn't have a way of assessing what they were being given. So I think getting this right is about investing in teachers and in teacher knowledge most of all. And I think getting this right is going to require that everyone, teachers, superintendents, lawmakers, school board members, parents, and reporters stay humble and curious and open to course correction, right? And that none of us, no one in this room believes so deeply in something that we aren't willing to question it or try it another way. So I do encourage all of you, and many of you I know so much more about this than I do, but dig into some of this research yourselves if you want to know more. It's really fascinating stuff. And the more knowledgeable we all are, the better our chances of getting this right for kids. So I put together this reading list. It's just 10 things. It was really hard to do. It could have been 100, but this is a place you can start. The reading list is on the podcast website, soldastory.org. So here's my contact information, and me again as a dorky first grader. So who wants to guess what year it was? Yes. Oh, 76. Something that was happening in 1976, besides me being a dorky first grader there, is that cognitive scientists were doing the first experiments that showed that the queuing theory wasn't right. Okay, so when I look at that picture of myself now, though, it's sort of famous in my family, this little photograph. So I've seen it many times, and you can even see if you look really carefully, I have a little bit of red nail polish on my fingernails, which means that my grandmother was recently visiting because she always painted my nails red. But when I look at that now, I see something that I really never thought about before. So the school had us pose in front of a shelf of books. This was in the school library, just a couple miles from here. I remember it well, I love the library. They sat us there with our hands on an open book. So think about how awful that might have been for a kid who couldn't read. And think about how haunting it would be to look at that photo now, to be looking at it and thinking, I was supposed to be learning how to read, but I wasn't. So thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. I look forward to the panel.